In this final video, I want to touch on a topic that is extremely important. That's one of the reasons why I've want to save it as its own video. And it's so important that perhaps it should have been at the beginning of this video, but in either case, I'm highlighting this point, and that is that After Effects includes a really amazing property called motion blur. And motion blur is a very important cinematic effect that really creates the illusion of movement. Now, we have been working without motion blur on this project so far, and to highlight what motion blur is, let's go back to the beginning of our composition, and let's just do a RAM preview to see how this whole thing plays out from beginning to end. We'll just play it once, and we can get a sense of what it's looking like.
I know who I am. I'm a dude playing a dude disguised as another dude.
Okay, well, that looks pretty good. But like I say, there's this aspect called motion blur that will make this look really good. So let's highlight that by going out a little bit in our current time indicator. And here I have the word I popping up on the screen and then slightly shifting off to the top left and some other words coming on, and they're shifting around. And you'll notice that the words themselves are very static. This is if anyone who's worked with Flash before knows, this is the way Flash often looked whenever anything moved. And there's a problem with this look that looks a little bit, well, like I say, there's a static quality to it. Now, watch what happens when I enable motion blur. Now, to enable motion blur, I actually have to open up the very first composition, the I know who I am composition. I'm going to double click that. And when I double click that, that opens up this composition, the original composition that I had created for this line. I'm just going to reveal all our layers here, and you'll notice in our layers or in our timeline panel here, there's a switch here called motion blur, and that's just this one circle with a couple of other circles coming off of it. And currently those are not selected, or there's no switches for each of those layers here. I'm going to just quickly click and drag down for motion blur on all these layers. So now motion blur is enabled for all of those layers. Now, what does that mean? Well, let's go back to our dude main composition. And here I'm going to enable motion blur. You'll see here that there is in fact another button for motion blur. Now, just to let you know, motion blur is a two-step process. The reason why there's two steps here is that because motion blur takes up a lot of RAM or processor speed, and it's nice to be able to turn it off when you want to be able to just preview something without having the processor crunch all the numbers for motion blur. But you'll notice here when I turn this on that this actually has the effect of creating a bit of a blur. And now watch as I scrub through this section here, and notice that there is now a blur associated with those words as they come on and move. Now that is a real that'll really help our eye to be able to see this motion a bit more clearly. The blur indicates the movement that these words are in, which the direction in which these words are moving, and I'm going to do that for each one of these compositions. Like I say, I probably should have done this as I was creating them, but like I say, I wanted to keep this motion blur idea separate just so that we really understand what's going on here. I'm going to click on I'm a Dude tutorial or composition, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to turn on motion blur for each one of those as well. Now, I actually do have two sub comps in each of these, so I'm going to double click those and turn on motion blur for that as well. And for this one down here called Chair Dude, double click, turn on motion blur, close that, and then now I have motion blur turned on for each one of those layers. I'm going to close that one. Let's go back to the Dude main and see what that does for our other. See, now watch as this hand comes on. See the blur associated with that hand? And even this graphic as it comes on has a bit of a blur associated with it. Even the weather vane now. Now those blurs are really important to be able to maintain a sort of cinematic quality. Now I've got motion blur associated with this composition, but I don't have it associated with this composition here. So I'm going to double click that, turn on motion blur for all those layers, go back to my dude main composition, and double click the disguised composition and turn on the motion blur for all those graphics as well. I can close these as I do them. Go back to the dude main, and again for the final composition as another, and I'm going to turn on motion blur for all those. Let's go back to dude main. Now as I scrub through, you can see that everything has a bit more of a naturalistic what's called motion blur associated with each of those graphics, and they're still crisp, clean graphics. It's just that they are now they have a bit of a motion blur attached to them. And now actually this one here needs to have that turned on. Not sure exactly why. Oh, continuously rasterized was not clicked on. Now, actually, maybe I should double check to make sure that I have continuously rasterized turned on. Haha, I didn't. Let's turn on continuously rasterized. Continuously rasterized and motion blur are again two very important switches to turn on in order to maintain a really good, clean look. And let's double click this and make sure, yep, that's all turned on. Okay. Let's go back to dude main, and again we're going to scrub, make sure that everything is got the proper amount of blur and the proper continuously rasterized buttons turned on. Now I'm thinking, now this, I'm going to go back to this I'm a dude section, and the chair dude is, double click that. Continuously rasterized has to be turned on for that one, and there we go. Sometimes you can end up not turning something on when you think it is turned on, but I just had to double click and make sure I went into those compositions and turned on both continuously rasterized and motion blur for both of those. And remember, the motion blur has to be enabled for that composition. Now I can turn this off. For example, like I say, it takes a bit of processor speed to be able to process this motion blur, and so I could, if I wanted to, turn that off at any time just by clicking that button for that composition. But I want to see what this looks like now with all that motion blur on. I'm going to take my current time indicator to the beginning. I'm going to press RAM preview and see what that looks like.
I know who I am. I'm a dude playing a dude disguised as another dude.